Hey everyone, it's Andy, the young berry farmer, coming to you again from the Little Red Shed. Now, if you're wondering why it's a little darker in here than usual, it's because Farmington, Minnesota just got hit with a big old storm. And it's still really cloudy out, and it's really wet out in the fields, so while I wait for it to dry out, I figured, why not shoot another video? So, lucky you guys. Now, I wanted to talk about another hot button topic that seems to be out there in the agricultural world, and it's an issue that's gaining traction sort of in more mainstream media or news articles, things like that, and that's the topic of plastics or the use of plastics in agriculture. And the narrative that I'm seeing most often whenever I read these articles is just portraying plastics as just this terrible thing that farmers do, that these lazy farmers are going out there and they're throwing plastic on the field in order to help them out just so they don't have to weed a little bit more. And then because of it, at the end of every single year, we have hundreds of thousands of pounds of plastics from agriculture that's getting thrown into landfills. And like most sensationalist articles, there is a kernel of truth built into the article itself, but it is far, 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 far from the whole story. So before I delve deeper into sort of the use of plastics in general in agriculture, I figured we could just go out into the field, take a look at the two types of plastics that I use, and then talk about the pros and cons of these types of plastics, why I use them, things like that. So let's take a hike. Now the first type of plastic that I use on my farm is this white on black poly. It's only 1 mil thick. That goes over the tops of all the raised beds on my entire field here. And this plastic really serves a lot of different purposes. The first thing that it does is it sort of protects the drip tube that I've got here that I use to irrigate and fertilize my crops. Another thing that it does really well is maintaining a more constant environment in the soil directly around the plants in this raised bed. So if you have a massive storm like I just had, the soil, around the bed itself is going to be really wet, but the soil underneath the bed is much, much drier, which is good for not flooding and deoxygenating the plant's roots. And then conversely, during a drought event, all the soil that's underneath the white on black plastic does a really good job of staying with a higher moisture content for a longer period of time. The biggest advantage of having plastic like this, as you could probably imagine though, is for weed control. If you see all of these native grasses and wild weeds that are growing in my walkways here, all that stuff that's there right now would be competing directly with my strawberries if I didn't have this plastic, and they just wouldn't have a chance. My yields would be so low that I'd be driven out of business almost immediately. And I still do have to weed a little bit. Sometimes you have weeds that pop up in these little holes where I planted the strawberries into, but it suppresses like 95 to 98% of the weeds that would be competing with my plants, and it's absolutely essential for me. Almost every single strawberry grower that grows commercially and in California, Mexico, places like that, they use a very similar system to this. The second type of plastic that I use is this woven landscape fabric that I put in between some of my walkways. And the obvious advantage for this is going to be for weed control in the walkways themselves. As you can see, where I don't have landscape fabric in between this walkway and this walkway, these grasses are already getting pretty big after just 1 week. I weed whacked this row last Monday. It's been 7 days, and we already have this much encroachment onto the raised beds. So you really have to stay on top of things, or else you're going to get competition even from the walkways themselves, even though they're much lower down than the raised beds are. All right, now we're back in the shed. It's a lot sunnier out. The clouds are gone. Hopefully you can see more than just half of my face. Let's talk more about the knocks on agricultural plastic. Now, the most common one, the one I see cited most often in a lot of these articles that I read, and honestly the most valid one, is the issue of waste in agricultural plastics and plastics in general. Any sort of agricultural plastic that can't be reused, the most often thing that happens to it is it does end up in a landfill. Now, there are efforts to try and recycle a lot of these agricultural plastics. There was a recycling facility for ag plastics in Minnesota that just shut down, I believe, last year. The biggest problem with this is that most recyclable plastics need to be very clean in order to work properly, and if you can guess, a lot of these ag plastics are covered with dirt, they're covered with soil, they're covered with hay, they're covered with animal everything. They're just covered with being out in the field, being part of a farm. So it's very hard to recycle these agricultural plastics. And while this is something that I think about a lot, and it's something that I definitely don't feel great about, and while it's true that many of these articles are quick to point out the problems of these agricultural plastics, what they almost always fail to acknowledge is that the ecological consequences of the alternatives to using plastic can be just as bad, if not worse. So two of the more common weed suppression techniques that farmers use a lot, especially in organic systems, are going to be mechanical cultivation and flame weeding, where mechanical cultivation is where you sort of drag behind a tractor this really elaborate device that stirs up the soil as you move across it, and that disturbs the weed seedlings as they're growing up, kills them off, hopefully. And then the flame weeding is actually pretty cool, but you're essentially torching these plants to the point where their cell walls burst, and all of the liquids inside those cells seep out and then eventually kills off the plant. And while it's true, these can be effective at reducing weeds and they aren't going to result in as much plastic ending up in landfills, the one thing that they are going to release a whole lot more of is fuel. It uses a whole lot of fuel for mechanical cultivation and even more for flame weeding because you need fuel to burn these plants. And I feel like in most society, we've been sort of trained to discount the ecological effect of using fuel in our everyday lives, but the truth is for every gallon of gasoline that we burn in any sort of process, it releases about 20 pounds of CO2 into the atmosphere. So if you start doing the math and adding things up, you think about how many acres I have, how much fuel I need in order to do these weeding techniques, and start combining them together with all the different times that you need to do it over the course of the season, it starts becoming clear that it's not as positive or beneficial of an alternative to plastic in terms of environmental sustainability. So to really hammer this concept home, we're going to do a little exercise here called farm math. So you may be wondering why I look like some discount bargain bin landscaper right now. I look like I'm prepping for the zombie apocalypse, but I only had like $20 to do it. I look like I'm the bad guy in some high school film student's first horror flick. But this is actually what I have to dress up in order to weed whack my entire field that isn't covered with landscape fabric. And let me tell you, it's just terrible. Weed whacking for any extended period of time puts a toll on your body. Your shoulders hurt. Your back hurts. I feel like I'm getting tennis elbow every single week. And if I didn't have any of my field covered with plastic, it would probably take about 8 hours a week and about a gallon of gas every single week just to keep my field maintained in terms of keeping the grass and the walkways down. If we add that up over the course of a 20-week field season, that comes up to around 160 labor hours and 20 gallons of gas just to keep things manageable. Now, if we assume that it would take about 8 hours to lay out an entire acre of my field with landscape fabric at the beginning of the year, that 8-hour effort would represent saving a total of 152 labor hours over the course of the entire field season, since I wouldn't have to weed whack, and it would prevent the release of over 400 pounds of CO2 into the atmosphere. Plus, I can reuse the landscape fabric every single year, so it wouldn't be going into a landfill for several years to come. Now, remember, I'm not trying to claim here that plastics are this environmentally benign silver bullet that we use on the farm, or that any other farmer who decides to control weeds in another way that maybe uses a little bit more fuel is wrong to do so. I'm just trying to point out that, like most things, the reality of the situations and decision-making processes that we have to make as farmers on these farms is a little bit more complex than what's usually represented in these moderately researched pop culture articles that are written about us. So, yeah, I hope I was able to get that through in a pretty easily accessible way, in a way that hopefully doesn't make a lot of people, upset or perturbed or, just trying to be objective about things and tell the whole story. So, yeah, that's it. I'm Andy, the young berry farmer. Feel free to give us a follow, subscribe, do anything that you want, comment. If you didn't like it, vote down. If you did like it, vote up. But yeah, thanks a lot. We should be posting some more videos soon, so thanks. I'll see you soon.